Welcome to Reimagining Soviet Georgia. I'm Sopo.
And I'm Brian.
We are really excited to have a friend of ours and a fellow editor at Left East, Adela Hîncu. I hope I said it correctly. There's an incredible book out if you haven't seen it, Text and Context from the History of Feminism and Women's Rights from East Central Europe, second half of the 20th century. That she co-edited, and I'm really excited to be able to discuss this with you today because I think it's so important to be able to conceptualize what Marxism and feminism look like in so-called the East. Thank you so much for being with us today. Could you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, thank you, Sopo and Brian, for inviting me to this wonderful podcast. I am Adela. I am an intellectual historian, trained originally at Central European University, but then moved around Eastern Europe for the past 5 years. I mostly write about the history of Marxist social thought and sociology or social sciences more broadly in Romania and East Central Europe, but also about the history of feminist thought and thinking about women's rights in the region. And this is where this book comes into play. I am currently a Marie Curie Fellow at the Institute of Contemporary History in Ljubljana, where I have a project on Eastern European sociologists' involvement in transnational networks of expertise in the late socialist period. But I'm also involved in projects on the history of philosophy in late socialist Eastern Europe, and also in an ERC project at the University of Vienna, led by Zsófia Lorand, on the history of women's political thought in East Central Europe over the long 20th century.
Excellent. We really want to start out with, I think, like a general, because you are a historian of, of philosophy, right? Why did you decide to even take on this huge project like this to translate and put together all the sort of feminist thoughts of Eastern Europe?
So the project was actually started and then coordinated throughout the, let's say, almost 10 years that it lasted by Zsófia Lorand, my colleague and good friend from Central European University. Zsófia wrote a very important book on the history of feminist thought in Yugoslavia. And from there, she decided that we know very little actually about women's political thought in this region as a whole. So the way that she went about, let's say, exploring this unknown history of ideas is that she connected with experts throughout Eastern Europe and established a sort of network of people that originally were asked to produce, let's say, a long list of texts from their national context that they would consider representative for women's political thought. And this was something that for many people, even researchers that were very much involved in the history of women in the region, producing a list of texts by women turned out to be quite an interesting and challenging experience. So we heard very often that, well, actually, there is nothing in our local context. We know of no women that had any political ideas of any consequence, or sometimes we were also told, oh, like there were these very important women in political positions, high-ranking politicians, but actually, their political thought is not that important. What matters was more their political practice. So we came across a lot of these hurdles at the beginning, which are, I think, illustrative of how women's political thought in the region is unknown, even in the region itself. So this is on top of then having this, let's say, unequal epistemic relationship between the East and the West, this idea that intellectual thought, including women's in Eastern Europe, should be judged by some imagined standards of what political thought should be in the West at that time. There's also this long-standing tradition of thinking of Eastern Europe as either backward or well, mostly backward compared to Western Europe. And so this idea goes into arguing that there couldn't have been women's political thought in this region for that reason. So all in all, there is a lack of understanding and of presence of women's political thinking from Eastern Europe in both local, regional, European, and global canons. And that's where this book sought to intervene. This was the beginning, the impetus for it. And then it lasted for so long, not just because it's a book of 1,000 pages and 500,000 words, but also because it was done completely voluntarily. So we never had funding for this. There was funding for some meetings here and there, depending on the institutions where we were based, but the only people that were actually paid for their labor were the translators. What emerged from this 10 years work is a collection of over 100 texts from kind of the history of women's thinking in Eastern Europe that are mostly translated for the first time in English. I think there are only one or two exceptions of texts that have been previously published in English. They've been translated from 20 languages. We've had, I think, over 30 translators working on these. And each of these sources, we call them source texts, are contextualized with a short biography of their author and also a text that gives a sense of the broader context in which the text was published.
Yeah, the subsections are quite amazing, actually. It's divided into different sections with legacy of the pre-1945 period. Then there's women and war, ideologies of women's emancipation, the international aspects of women's rights, politicizing motherhood and fatherhood, time budgets and double burden, violence against women and gender-based violence in women in politics and reproductive rights, demography, and health and body sexuality. Debating Western feminisms, which was actually interesting, the one I kind of read more, dissidents, transitions, and that's like pretty extensive and interesting sort of spectrum of thought. Because we are mostly about Soviet Union history or state socialism on our podcast, I also was very much maybe a victim of propaganda in the sense that I understood feminism, activism, and writers in the sort of Western civil society kind of way. Like this, it's not like in the government that this activism happens. And I was shocked a few years ago when I went to a conference about Eastern feminist, state socialist feminism. I was like, oh, I don't know why I never, because I was very much like shaped my own understanding of framework of the world was very much shaped by my experience living in the US of like sort of very Western propaganda, And so I was, shocked that there was all this like activism within the state for all these women's rights and emancipation and how they were thinking about women's rights. And so maybe you can discuss that because I find that to be the most interesting for me, for our audience as well.
Yeah, thank you, Sopo. Maybe before getting to your question, I can say a couple of words about the themes because you mentioned them. And I just wanted to also explain how we got to this thematic organization of the volume. Because as I mentioned originally, we started with country-based collection of texts from each national context. But then we really didn't want this to be a book about, feminist and women's political thought in Romania, in Hungary, in Yugoslavia. And so the thematic organization was meant exactly to kind of give a regional and comparative context for these texts that in the end originated in national context and are often contextualized as such by the authors. And so This resulted in this game of puzzle pieces where sometimes maybe we excluded a text from one country because we already had three texts on that topic from other three countries. Or sometimes we moved text from one topic to another just to create a sense of both difference and similarity between these contexts. And I think this type of organization was actually extremely useful because it really allowed us to see, for instance, which kind of topics were common throughout Eastern Europe. So, for instance, when I started collecting text from Romania, there was this really wonderful text about the double burden, and I thought, oh, this must be really exceptional. And then it turns out that actually double burden is the kind of topic that you find very predictably in each of the countries that the book covers, and that the arguments are very similar. So there's this sense of kind of recognition. But then there were topics like women and war or sexuality, where it was much more difficult, starting from like the idea that we should cover this topic, to find texts that fit in all the contexts. And then there was this sense of, okay, there is research to be done, but also this kind of trying to get a text by knowing that something similar exists somewhere else. Opened up this kind of research. So this is just a little bit on why we have these themes. And also, maybe I should have mentioned that this book is focused on the socialist period, so post-war socialist period, but we do have these two chapters at the beginning and at the end that cover pre-1945 traditions of women's political thought, which we thought were really important in terms of how they are then picked up again or continued or challenged in the socialist period. And we also have this chapter on transitions that mostly focuses on what happens in the 1990s, but also from this perspective of how women in the 1990s reflect on what had happened during the socialist period and what that means for women's rights and for feminist thinking after socialism. And now to get to your question of women's very impressive political work within women's organizations. I think this is really crucial, and it has actually been a topic of a contention and debate in recent historiography. I will not go into the details on this discussion, but you've already a bit drawn the lines of, I think, confrontation, let's call it there, which is this idea that women, it starts from the idea of women's agency and the expectation that women that are involved in mass communist organizations would lack this kind of agency, and therefore what they do is not necessarily their own, but they are, sometimes the word used is transmission belts for party policies. So they have no kind of will of their own, and they do not influence policy, but are simply kind of enforcers of what has been decided on the top, mostly by important, powerful men. And from the side of new historiography coming from Eastern Europe and about Eastern Europe, this idea has been challenged in many ways, partly by challenging the very concept of agency and its kind of Western liberal interpretation of what it means and why is it central. And partly simply by doing really good historical work of reconstruction of what these women's organizations were actually doing, what were their policies, to what extent they contributed both at kind of improving women's lives on the ground and at intervening in policy making on issues that were essential to women's rights. And this includes everything from the work of social reproduction, the infrastructure necessary for this, to health and women's reproductive rights. Also, often women's organizations challenge the state on policies that are meant, for instance, at redressing demographic anxieties, and so on. So there is a lot of historical work that has been done on this. And this is the kind of work on which this book is actually based. So we do not look so much at the social history of women in the region, but based on the important work that exists and can be reconstructed from the extensive bibliographies actually that we have for every chapter. We build on this, the history of women's ideas and political thought.
You talked about some of the similar themes that you found in going through some of these texts, but I'm also in looking at the sources of the text. You have some that were from the Soviet Union, some that were from Eastern European socialist states, and you also have some from socialist Yugoslavia. And I'm curious, did you see any differences or some pronounced differences between the kinds of ideas that were coming out of the Soviet Union, that were coming out of Yugoslavia, or that were coming out of the Eastern European socialist states?
This is a really important question. And as I said, I think the fact that these texts can coexist with each other within a certain theme allows exactly for these kinds of comparisons. And when the project was started, as I mentioned, Rofia Lorand had worked extensively on feminist thought in Yugoslavia, which she published in her book, The Feminist Challenge to the Socialist State in Yugoslavia. And she had reconstructed this immense history of feminist thought in Yugoslavia, that manifested in all kinds of ways, in theoretical articles, in journalism, in arts, performance arts, in media. So she found this immense, rich history of women's thinking and activism, including activism against domestic labor and violence against women, through organizing these SOS lines for women at the end of the 1980s. And then, with this kind of knowledge of what existed in Yugoslavia, looking at the rest of socialist Eastern Europe, then there was always this, I think, discrepancy between the Yugoslav context and the rest of Eastern Europe. So some of the themes we do find in Eastern Europe as well, but there is, I think, not as much creativity in the way that the arguments are constructed. This is not necessarily this doesn't necessarily say anything about the quality of women's political thought, but also about the local languages and tradition of how women could intervene politically. And I would like to give an example, but I have to think a bit what would be a good example of this. Maybe I'll return to this. And then with the countries of the Soviet Union that we included, which are Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Belarus. There is, I think, in these texts, especially in the Ukrainian and Belarusian texts, there is much more discussion of dissidence and resistance against the Soviet state. We have texts on dissidence in the Eastern European context as well, but we find that in the texts that we have collected from this context, somehow this issue is more prominent. On the other hand, there are texts from Estonia, I believe, or no, Latvia, that discuss the issue of domestic violence in a way that I haven't seen discussed in other countries of Eastern Europe. So I wouldn't say that there are any essential differences, but it is still interesting to look and, I guess, reflect on why one topic appears in different ways in, as you said, in these three types of countries, three types of contexts.
What are some of the more important interventions within building socialism in, we can say, in the Eastern Bloc, we could say in the Soviet Union, but you said most of the texts are much more sort of anti-Soviet. So in the Eastern Europe, sorry, what are some of the more important interventions that you consider or interesting to you that you hadn't thought about before until you read it?
So I don't think this is something that should have been surprising, but looking at these texts taken all together, I think what is the most important intervention is this approach to women's condition, to women's rights, from a materialist perspective. So this idea that economic independence is the basis for women's emancipation, which of course, to anyone who read some Engels or Bebel, then it should come as no surprise, but nevertheless, seeing the extent to which these women invested in focusing on women's economic circumstances, their participation in labor, their material conditions, and the infrastructure necessary for them to perform social reproductive labor, while also being engaged in political life in an active and meaningful way. All this is really something very impressive. And you can see this coming again and again throughout the socialist period. So beginning from, and even before the socialist period. So some of the texts that we include in the pre-1945 chapter are very much about how women's economic independence is more important even than women's political rights. So there is, for example, this very impressive text by Angela Vode, who was a Slovenian political thinker and anti-fascist activist. And she argues exactly this. She says that what good to have political rights if you are going to elect the fascists in power. She was writing this text in 1934. And so this idea that economic independence trumps, let's say, political participation has been then in the 1960s and 70s very much simplified in these debates between, like Western feminism and socialist thinking on women's rights. But I think that if we take distance from these debates and confrontations of that time, and we really look at what these women were arguing, that is really something that we can take from this text as an absolute basis of discussion of women's rights from a socialist standpoint. And then this comes in all kinds of ways. So also when socialist women are involved in on the international arena in, for instance, in the UN Decade for Women. So this started in 1975, and it was in large extent the achievement of Women's International Democratic Federation, which was the largest umbrella organization of communist and leftist women in the post-war period. And through their lobby at the UN, 1975 was established as International Women's Year, and then for 1 decade, then there continued to be meetings on the issue of women's condition in the contemporary world globally. And of course, socialist women also participated in these events, and they were very much critical. For example, Vida Tomšič writing after 1975, they were very much critical of this Western, let's say, bourgeois, white feminist approach to women's condition that avoided discussion of global economic inequalities and how they will maintain women's inequality regardless of interventions that have to do, let's say, just with gender equality. And So there was this kind of criticism coming again from this perspective of women's right to economic independence and participation in labor against these more liberal approaches that did not question capitalism in any form but worked within it. And then I think there are interesting interventions by women from Eastern Europe on all the major topics that we can imagine in relation to women. So in each of these chapters, you will find a text that will be incredibly surprising and inspiring. So I think in the chapter on, I actually don't know in which chapter, but there's this text by Agnes Heller and Mihai Vaida, which is this actually quite famous, but still, like incredibly exceptional in the context of the time, discussion of feminist structure during socialism. And it is this criticism of the bourgeois family model that they say continued to exist under socialism, was reproduced during socialism, and which maintains inequalities between men and women, but also between, let's say, adults and children, for example. And what they were proposing instead of this was basically the model of a commune. And so a community of free individuals organized democratically, and where each participant could have many-sided human relations, the way that they formulated this, also between children and adults. Where the development and realization of individuality was very essential, but this not understood in a, let's say, liberal way, but understood in the sense of freedom to choose human relations, even in childhood. And so not being bound to this relationship between child and parent. And also they wrote about the necessity to eliminate these conflicts that come both out of monogamy and out of attempts to dissolve monogamy. So this was a very exceptional Marxist take on the development of the family under socialism.
How did socialism incubate socialist feminist ideas that couldn't have not been able to grow in like capitalist countries? Socialism opens up different kinds of possibilities, right? Which did not exist under capitalism. So how did feminists take advantage of that? How is their thought also developed in different ways because of at least the anticipation of socialism?
Women reflect a lot on these circumstances of socialism that make it possible for them and others, especially marginalized groups that had not really been, involved in public life, to do so. By marginalized groups, I mean rural women, Romani women, for instance. And this comes in numerous articles that have a very similar structure, and that is an overview of the kind of advances to women's material and social conditions in the post-war period under socialism. And this includes discussion of women's increased participation in political life, women's impressive integration in productive labor. So exit from, like this isolation of the household. Also, women's civic participation, so their involvement in organizing communities, participation in committees at the factory level, at the town level, and so on. And after this discussion of these basic fundamental conditions that have made women's lives and involvement possible, there's always criticism of the limitations of what exists and discussion of what should be, what still needs improvement at the minimum. And sometimes discussion is less about improvement and more about the need for systemic change. And here, if we were to follow the same logic on the issue of women's integration in labor, there is always discussion of how women continue nevertheless to also provide household labor. So this is the issue of the double burden, and how there is need for more infrastructure, for more kindergartens, for more schools, for canteens, for services, and so on. Then on the issue of women's political participation, there is the reality of the fact that they never achieve equality in numbers to men, but also that they never hold as high positions with as much power as men. And then there is discussion of how do you address that. In some countries, like in Romania, they introduced quotas for women's participation that were never really achieved, although these quotas nevertheless increased the number of women in position of power. This was especially a problem in management, so in the field of let's say productive labor, women were always systematically still in positions of less skilled labor. They're less paid, and they very rarely reached leadership positions in management. So this is always brought up. And so in this way, many authors in this volume, actually, who many of them were committed to communism and very much, proud and proud to have been part of constructing this new regime in which women had more access at potential equality, let's say. They were also building up on this criticism of how this could be improved. And this example of communal life and community is just, I think, one of the more extreme examples of taking this idea to its kind of final consequences of if we take, classic Marxist positions into consideration, where would they lead us? So, famously, Engels, in his discussion of women's position or women's equality and the emancipation of women, he didn't really he didn't really give an idea of how this would look in practice. He went at great lengths to analyze the connection between private property and women's exploitation and inequality within the family and in social life, but he didn't really imagine how this would look in reality in a socialist society. Bebel did a bit more of this. He did kind of project a world in which women would be free in their choice of partners, where there would be less sexual prudery, where relationships could be dissolved at will, and so on. And how this could all be accomplished, first of all, by abolishing what he called the rule of man over men, including the rule of the capitalist over the laborer. So women were very much building on these ideas, and then, as I said, trying to take them to their kind of logical consequences. And this, for some, this led to versions of Marxist revisionist thought, like in the case of Heller, and for others, they went more in a direction of feminist criticism of these classical Marxist positions that saw class as the fundamental kind of organizer of society rather than gender. And in those cases, the challenge was more towards this simplified understanding of what this position that started from economic inequality meant.
I was thinking about your book that you edited this, I should say. I was thinking about this, and in the context of only a few years ago, it seems like actually she wrote one of the about authors, Kristen Godsey, wrote a book called Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism. And it caused kind of a splash in that people were really talking about some kind of reconceptualization of how we think about feminism, because one of the ideas that comes straight out of your book that seems to parallel that one is that there's something about the woman's experience in socialist societies that is important for people in 2025 to be reading about, understanding, and engaging with. And I know all of the debates that Godsey's book was kind of sparking in this vein. And so a few years ago, I think it came out in 2018. So, on that note, why do you think it's important for people, men, women, and others, both in Europe, outside of Europe, in Eastern Europe, in the post communist world, to be reading about socialist feminist thought or feminist ideas coming from the socialist world? Why is that useful today, and what can that give people?
Thank you, Brian. We are actually asked this very often in the book discussions that we have been having. And this question comes in many forms, including why should we care about Eastern Europe? Why should we care about socialism? Why should we care about women's thinking specifically in socialism? And I have been I've been thinking about this quite a lot, and in the end, I came to an answer that is really very simple and basic, which is that this region is important simply by the reality of having had this historical experience of implementing socialism. So with all its limitations, constraints, failures to fulfill its promises, this has been really an outstanding historical experience. And I think looking at it, I wouldn't say dispassionately, but looking at it a bit by putting aside this ongoing Cold War debates about socialism, capitalism, East, West, actually opens up to a wealth of ideas. And I think this is what this book does. It shows if you take socialism seriously and if you look into what that meant for women and for their political thought, then you come up with all kinds of ideas. Some of them still sound incredibly contemporary. For instance, some of my colleagues, and we've heard from others as well, have been using this book for teaching. And they have reported that someone was reading a chapter by, let's say, Caterina Oproiu, this a journalist from Romania, and they found it very, very much contemporaneous with their own thinking about women's position. And I think this is something very precious, this moment of recognition, that then should come with a moment of reflection of, first of all, why are we still kind of encountering the same issues of 15, 60 years ago, and also to what extent one can continue the thinking that these women had started at that time and which was quite brutally interrupted in the post-socialist period. I should mention that very few of these women are known, as I said, not just outside of their national context, but within their national context, because mostly, especially the Marxist tradition of political thought was completely erased after 1989. And so, yeah, I think people should read this both as a work of historical justice to recover the lives, biographies, political ideas of these women, but also as a work of reconstruction and kind of continuation and going back to some of these ideas and kind of seeing them also in the context of our times, continuing some of these struggles.
You kind of alluded to it, but that was what I was going to bring up next, which was how did feminist thinking change with the collapse, destruction, and dismemberment of socialism, not only in the Marxist tradition, which in many of these states, as you know, purged sort of Marxist thinking from the society to the best of their ability in an anti-communist direction, but also just feminism in general. Like, how did the thinking about women's place in society, in the world, politically, socially, economically change?
I will give you the example of Romania because that's the one that I know best, but with the caveat that actually Romania turns out to be a bit of an outlier in this story. So it's one of the more extreme cases of how this played out in the 1990s. And in the case of Romania, the kind of liberal feminist thought that emerged in the 1990s was not only completely separate from whatever had existed before in terms of thinking about women's equality, but it was inherently based on, it was inherently anti-communist. So feminist liberal thought in this case evolved as a confrontation and as a dissociation from what was kind of implanted as this authoritarian previous experience of women. And the idea here was, so the way that, let's say, the two main authors in Romania, Mihaela Miroiu and Laura Grunberg, articulated this was as a series of kind of connected marginalities. So women were marginal as women in an authoritarian regime in what they called state patriarchy. Also, women were marginal as being Eastern European women. So this idea of Eastern Europe continuing to have this subordinate position to the West. And these together connected actually produced the most kind of profoundly, inherently anti-communist perspective on women in the post-socialist period, I think, in Eastern Europe. And it took quite a while for that to be challenged. And eventually it was challenged from different directions, including Roma feminist positions and LGBTQI perspectives. But it was the way in which feminist thought was reconstructed immediately after 1989 and contributed, I believe. So it wasn't just, I don't think it's enough to say that it was influenced by the anti-communist rhetoric of the time, but it was an essential part of that anti-communist rhetoric, that whatever economic emancipation women had or experienced during a communism, it was irrelevant considering that they had not been free to develop their own individuality, like to follow their own will.
Now, what I find interesting is, not interesting, sad actually, in Georgia, I haven't researched about like Soviet Georgian women's urban emancipation thinkers within it. The ones that are often cited during modern feminists, contemporary feminists, are mostly like anti-communists or pre-Soviet Union, or like the Socialist Republic for like 3 years that we had, and so on. So there's, it's a very anti-communist, anti-socialist feminism, and very NGO feminism here, which is, understandable in one respect because there's no other money coming in to fund any of this kind of research. But it's also what makes it less innovative, interesting in some sense. And not a lot of even research is not really dedicated to it. There's no one here that's willing to do like sort of Soviet feminist thought in an unbiased, earnest way either. So lots of problems trying to discover and trace and understand different conceptions. But one thing that's stuck out, and I think you addressed it to some level, but I think women voting for the government. It's like the definition of feminism often here is like women's right to vote. They take on the talking points of the West, and they think that this is like they talk about women's right to vote in a way that makes zero sense here. And they only understand civic participation in that way. And the other is like parliament quotas. And so can you maybe discuss what did civic participation look like during socialism and what, some of the thinkers that you include discuss, what that means. And that's not just a sort of NGO, civil society, or the right to vote, but like other forms.
Yeah, there is an entire chapter on women's participation in politics. So to the question of civic participation and how this was imagined during socialism, their discussion there of what it means for women to be politically involved meaningfully beyond just quotas, like beyond just kind of being there in the sufficient numbers. But I think your question was more, as far as I understood, more kind of geared toward the post-socialist period. And it made me think it's an interesting example of, it made me think of Lithuania, which immediately in the post-socialist period actually had a women's party, so specifically women's party. And that was a very interesting combination of, on the one hand, somewhat nationalist rhetoric, and on the other hand, a mix of, let's say, capitalist market-oriented rhetoric, but combined with ideas about social protection, women's social protection, protection of mothers, of working women, of children, that was very much reminiscent of the previous discussions. So, and then at the same time, these women were arguing that they do not necessarily represent, so that they do not represent a separate women's politics. That should be kind of understood as part of the general reconstruction politics of the post-socialist period, in Lithuania's case, post-Soviet period. And so I think that even on this issue of how women's participation in politics was understood, there is a lot of diversity that can be found. So if you look, for instance, at this party, it's not this kind of what you described as the NGOization and focus on women's voting. It is still a combination of ideas that come from the socialist period and kind of new ideas of political liberalism. And so I think what would be interesting, and we couldn't do in this book, is to trace how ideas about women's participation in civic life actually change from this, 1950s and women's massive integration into labor and into political life, into 1960s with women's participation in, protest movements, oppositional movements, dissident movements. There are some interesting chapters on Ukrainian women in the dissident movement and what it meant to be political in that. Sometimes to be political was to provide food and shelter and, make copies of documents. And then from that into the post-socialist period, how these ideas didn't kind of immediately, how these ideas related to women's economic condition didn't immediately disappear, but were kind of hybridized. And then how we got from that to NGOization, which is something that we really don't cover in this volume. So it already comes after the 90s where this volume ends. I think what is interesting on this issue of political participation after socialism is also how women that had been marginalized, including under socialism, get into political activism. So in the volume, we had the case of Nicoleta Bițu, who is a Romani feminist activist. And the text that we have included from her is a report that was written for the Council of Europe at the end of the 1990s. And I think it was one of the first reports on the situation of Roma women in Eastern Europe. And there was discussion of like what were considered taboo topics at the time, like the relationship between tradition and women's rights, the issue of women's trafficking, but also the position of Roma women activists within the Roma civic movements in the 1990s. So I think this integration or this this integration of the political thought of women that have been previously marginalized, including under the supposedly fully emancipatory socialist regimes of the region, is also a very important topic. And this happens to some extent through the mediation of European institutions, but it also very interestingly resonates back into the local context. So, for instance, Nicoleta Bițu was very much considered to be a traitor of the nation by some of the male or women conservative members of the Roma civic movement in Romania at that time. So there is also this interesting interplay between European and national political institutions that that happens not just actually in the 1990s, but also during socialism with women's involvement in international organizations. So I wanted to mention, because Brian brought up Kristen Gozzi, and I wanted to mention that her chapter in the volume, which is about Elena Lagadinova, and the source is Lagadinova's speech in Nairobi in 1985 at this kind of closing conference of the UN Decade of Women. In this speech, Lagadinova expresses solidarity, not just of Bulgarian women, but solidarity of socialist women with the women of South Africa, Namibia, Palestine, and Nicaragua. And so she explicitly discusses this issue of unequal political, economic, social circumstances and women in conditions of war, confrontation, apartheid, foreign occupation, aggression, and so on, and expresses solidarity. But also, as Kristen Gozzi argues, she expresses something that we would nowadays maybe call intersectionality, so interest in the way in which gender, class, and race intersect. And this is something that also then comes up in the 1990s in the feminist thinking of this Romani author that I mentioned, Nicoleta Bițu, for whom intersectionality is, like the big discovery of the 1990s.
What was your favorite section and why? Like what was it that was the most interesting to you and you were like, wow, why did you sort of include some of the writers in this section? Because I know you said that some things you had to let go of because it was redundant. So what is like your favorite part that captured your sort of imagination the most?
I don't know that I have a favorite part, but I can, because you also mentioned the section on debating Western feminisms, maybe I can tell you about my favorite experience with working on this book, not just as an editor, but as an author as well. So in this section, we include an article by Stana Buzatu, who is a philosopher who wrote the one and only book on feminism in Romania in the 1970s, in which she basically gave an overview, very detailed overview of contemporary feminist thought in Western Europe. And for me, this is very special because she agreed to interview. So I I have met her personally, and I've discussed with her in detail about her experience of being a member of the of being a secretary of the WIDF, Women's International Democratic Federation in Berlin, from the mid 1960s to the early 1970s, and how that experience of connecting with women from across the globe was then built up into her understanding of women's equality and women's position in socialism. And I also found her and her thinking very interesting, maybe for two reasons. One of them is that maybe you know that Romania was infamously limiting abortion drastically after mid 1960s. Abortion was limited to only very few cases, and Stana Busatu, in her book, while reviewing Western feminist thought, also discusses at length the position on abortion in France at that time, and these ideas about how women should have the freedom to choose over their own body and their reproductive health, including by taking contraceptives. And although she's very kind of attentive, very clear to limit this discussion to the capitalist world, I think simply including it in this book at that time in the late 1970s was an act of, I would say, bravery. And then the second thing that she does, which is very interesting, is that in her own words, she uses opportunistically the official language of party pronouncements or the discourses of Nicolae Ceausescu, let's say, in order to advance ideas about women's rights and women's equality. And she does this very specifically about conceptual innovation. So she argues that political language should also include the word sexism, the concept of sexism, and she does this by comparison with racism and underdevelopment, and basically by using in this kind of creative way a party speech by Nicolae Ceausescu, in which he says that racism and underdevelopment should be integrated into the political language of Marxism. She says in the same way racism should be included because it will then sexism should be included because then it will make apparent a reality that has been naturalized, like the reality of women's inequality and women's discrimination ongoing under socialism. So this section to me as a whole is particularly interesting because I think it complicates our understanding of how Marxist women from Eastern Europe engaged with Western feminism. So it wasn't just this kind of simplistic, combative, dismissive discussion of Western feminism as bourgeois ideology, but women like Stana Buzatu and others in this chapter were actually very attentively reading and very intelligently arguing from Marxist positions about how class and economic independence and like state support mattered for women's condition at the time. So it wasn't just a game of simple dismissal of this. And I think even I as a historian, found this to be inspiring and something that I would like to see more. I'd like to see done more. Ooh. And this section can be read very interestingly together with a section on women's presence in like international aspects of women's rights. There are a lot of connections there. Final thought, and also connecting to, I think, the struggles that we are having today, I wanted to mention that this book illustrates very well the huge tradition of women's anti-fascist organizing during the Second World War. And maybe to finish with one poem that we always somehow include in our book discussions because everyone relates to it very nicely. it's a poem by Ina Yun Broda, who was a partisan, and she was writing very beautifully about the condition of women in the anti-fascist resistance. And one of the poems is called Self-Criticism, in which she goes through various aspects of being a woman among men in the anti-fascist movement, and finishes this poem very beautifully by saying, "It is too hard, comrades, that's what I said, bullet in the head, but when they put me in front of a wall, once again I will boldly exclaim, death to fascism and freedom, freedom, freedom for the woman." And I wanted just to suggest to your listeners to also look into the very beautiful pieces of literature and art that are included in this book, because sometimes they are even more eloquent about women's thinking in a socialist period than the theoretical articles.